Okay, so utilitarianism has some attractive features, yeah? As I indicated earlier, it's got a kind of simplicity to it that's attractive. It seems to align pretty nicely with how we intuitively go about solving problems on a daily basis by using this kind of cost-benefit analysis. And unlike egoism, which really focuses on these different individual self-interests and then compels people to sort of compete and cooperate with each other to get all of these different self-interests satisfied, utilitarianism spans out the scope of concern to the collective. Literally, everybody who has a stake in a decision has their interests taken into account when making that decision. So standing for the greatest good for the greatest number seems like a principle that we can consistently stand for. And when I say consistently, I mean this. We want to stand for something, and we want to think of ourselves, and we want to be thought of, and we want to live as a person who has a particular set of values that we can consistently rely on. We're not the type of person that one day values this, the next day values something contradictory. We want to try to be consistent. So it seems like with utilitarianism, we could be consistent, right? So what really happens if we stand for the greatest good for the greatest number? Well, one thing that could happen is sort of captured in this argument that I asked you to consider in your thought primer. The argument goes like this. Premise number one says, if secretly enslaving some number of people to perform free labor will produce more happiness, pleasure, satisfaction for a greater number of people than will be produced if we don't enslave some number of people, then secretly enslaving some number of people is the morally correct action. Premise number two says secretly enslaving some number of people to perform free labor will produce more happiness, pleasure, satisfaction for a greater number of people than will be produced if we don't enslave some number of people. Therefore, we come to this very morally dubious conclusion that enslaving some number of people is the morally correct action. So we've actually arrived at a conclusion that slavery would be a morally correct action. Now, this argument is valid. What that means is the way that the ideas are structured here, if we accept the two premises as true statements, then to be rational and consistent, we would have to also accept the conclusion as a true statement. Now, when you look at these two premises, the second one we could hash out and argue about, would enslaving some number of people actually result in the greater goods of happiness, satisfaction, and contentment than not enslaving them? It doesn't seem impossible that we could come to the conclusion that this second premise is true. After all, this slavery is occurring in secret, and there's a benefit that everyone is going to derive from this free labor that's being performed that we wouldn't derive were those people not enslaved. So it seems like an argument could be made that because nobody's going to be experiencing the psychological distress of knowing that slavery is occurring, they would just be reaping the benefits, the rewards of this slavery. So that takes us to our first premise. Is that true? It seems like a very counterintuitive kind of statement. But according to utilitarian principles, whatever it is that produces the greatest good for the greatest number is by definition the morally right thing to do. So by utilitarian principles, it seems like this first premise is true. And if both these premises are true, then we've come to a moral conclusion that does not align with our intuition, right? It seems to be an immoral conclusion, and yet we got there by making a moral argument using utilitarian principles in a perfectly consistent manner. All right, so you can see there may be a problem with utilitarianism. There's a problem when we take the focus away from individuals and locating value in those individuals and placing it out onto the collective where the individuals serve the interests of the collective, okay? So this is one of the flaws with utilitarianism, is that it allows us to make arguments like this one. Another flaw with utilitarianism is that it's going to compel individuals to sort of forfeit their own interests for the sake of the collective. So they would be compelled, if they're going to be consistent as utilitarians, they would be compelled to make arguments that may actually be against their own best interest, but in the interest of the collective. And they would have to make those arguments and advocate for those positions, even though it's against their own interest to have those ideas weigh out. All right, so we'll start looking at some theories that try to address some of these problems.